Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Potawatomi Casino Hotel Milwaukee, home to 24/7 excitement, dining, and an on-site hotel at 1721 West Canal Street. More information at potawatomi.com.
You're listening to Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR station. Here's one of our favorite conversations about the people, places, and organizations that shape Milwaukee.
A New York Times investigation has uncovered sexual abuse allegations against Latino civil rights leader Cesar Chavez. Since then, cities throughout the country have removed or are considering removing Chavez's name from buildings, street signs, plaques, and more. In Milwaukee, a statue of Chavez at Rey Family Market was removed on Chavez Drive. City leaders say there will be a conversation about renaming the street as well. And Milwaukee's celebration of Cesar Chavez Day has been canceled. WUWM's race and ethnicity reporter Teran Powell is joined by Marquette professor Sergio Gonzalez. He shares his perspective on reevaluating how we honor historical figures.
Let's just start with the movements that he was a part of in Latino civil rights. I can admit that my knowledge of Cesar Chavez is not extensive, but let's talk briefly about his work. And how people came to center him and really honor him compared to, other leaders of the movement. Why was he so significant?
Absolutely. So Chavez has historically been recognized as one of the most important figures in two really big movements from the 1960s. One, of course, is the Migrant Farm Worker Union movement that started out of California, but had different manifestations across the United States, and really put the issue of migrant farm workers in California and across the country on a national stage. The other is kind of the larger movement of Mexican-American civil rights, often referred to as Chicano civil rights, of that very same period. And Chavez kind of became one of the most important figures as he was recognized across the country for his advocacy and for his effectiveness in building this broad-based social movement that became much more than this regional or California movement, but a national movement. During this period, he was kind of placed on the same stage as individuals like the Reverend Martin Luther King. He shared the stage with people like Robert F. Kennedy, and was recognized for his work during that period. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, his status kind of grew nationally as he was commemorated as kind of one of the most important figures of Mexican American and Latino civil rights. And I think the fact that he has kind of assumed such a large position in the American imagination speaks to two different things. One, of course, is the fact that Latinos have grown as a population across the country, and we've been kind of trying to find ways as a nation to commemorate the history of this people. The other fact, of course, is, as you mentioned, many people might know the name of Chavez, but they might not know his history, which speaks to the fact that Americans are still doing a lot of work to catch up to understand the history of a people that have been a part of this country since before parts of this country even part of the United States.
Talk about why that kind of recognition was significant as well, him kind of being immortalized in those ways.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the fact, again, that, a lot of Americans didn't have a large Rolodex to pull from when they were thinking about important figures in American history who are of Latino descent. And Chavez would often be kind of the go-to individual. People would kind of remember his historic marches, his leadership in the 1960s and 1970s. And so everywhere from, California to Wisconsin to Washington State to Florida, when places would be named in honor of Latino individuals and Latino communities, his would be the name that would rise up. And on one hand, that kind of speaks to, of course, the importance of the farm worker movement of the 1960s and 1970s. It also speaks to the fact that sometimes local communities have not sufficiently commemorated their own Latino community's history. That's the case here in Wisconsin, of course. The fact that 16th Street was renamed after Chavez instead of the numerous individuals of Latino descent who are of importance here in Milwaukee, across the state of Wisconsin, is really taken the work of community members and historians to better fill in those academic holes that exist so that we're not kind of turning to a figure from a different state who was only in Wisconsin a number of times, a handful of times for commemoration. And I think The moment that we're in right now, as Chavez's name is being taken down, as his statue is being taken down in places like Milwaukee, as is the case across the United States, it's forcing a lot of different reckonings. And I'm hoping we can talk about those. One of them, of course, is the question of whose stories and which community stories are going to be commemorated in public spaces.
That made me just think about, we just in Milwaukee, they renamed the Fourth Mineral Play area is now Clementina Castro Park. And I think that gets as recognizing, work locally, these figures that have had, equal kind of impact.
That's exactly right. You have, the Castro family has done a phenomenal job to preserve the story of Clementina Castro, and she was one of these individuals who spent her entire life advocating for Latinos on the South Side and across the state of Wisconsin. But her story might have been lost had it not been the work of her family, as well as local community members who have been trying to make sure that we recognize these individuals who play such a pivotal role in making the community what it is today. So it speaks to two different things. One is, of course, the work that we have to do as a state to better understand the history of Latinos who, I will note, have been in Wisconsin for over 100 years, have been members of the state for such a long period of time, and yet who barely register as a footnote among most of our institutional histories of this place that we love. The second thing, of course, is the constant reckoning that we have to have as a community about the way in which we decide to commemorate individuals, communities, institutions, and social movements. There are, of course, pitfalls when you decide to raise someone up to an elevated position so high as someone like Chavez, rose in the American imagination, in the minds of Latinos across the United States. Because when you place someone on a pedestal, of course, it sometimes puts blinkers on the way in which we kind of recognize not just their great achievements, but more importantly, I think in a situation like this, their faults as well.
So as we continue to talk about his name, imagery, likeness, coming down from all these things, everybody's still trying to figure out like next steps, like what do we do? Some people are even talking about renaming things after Dolores Huerta, who, of course, is one of the women who has come forward and is also co-founder of the National Farm Workers Association. What's the impact you see of taking the name, the imagery down, like if it does anything to the movement, the impact of, his work as a whole? Recognizing he also did not do that work by himself, but.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we need to view this as an opportunity to reckon with the past of a social movement, the past of a community, but also see it as an opportunity to educate a larger public. You mentioned Dolores Huerta, who played such an important and pivotal role in the creation of the farm workers movement and has continued to this day to be an important voice in advocating for Latinos in questions of immigration, economic policy, and labor rights. This is an opportunity not so much, I think, to cancel, to use kind of the terminology that we often fall into in 2026, but to rethink the way in which we want to preserve these stories. And I think most importantly, share these stories with our students, share these students with our communities. One of the dangers, of course, of building monuments, of naming streets after people is that they exist in a sense of permanence, right? If you build a statue to someone, you can't do anything to change that statue once it's there other than take it down. When you name a street after someone, it exists on a street sign, but there's not much space to have a deep conversation about who this individual was or what they represented. And so I think one of the things that communities like Milwaukee is going to have to go through, as is happening across the country, is to talk about the way in which we commemorate the history of individuals, of social movements, more importantly, of communities, whether we think that physical structures are the best way to do that, or more importantly, if they are the only way to do that. We'll never get away from the way in which we kind of commemorate history in those public ways, whether it's statues or naming sites after people. But there has to be a larger way in which we do this work so that we can have those complicated conversations. So it's not the black and white of canceling and forgetting or celebrating and putting on a pedestal. But again, to see these people as living human beings who participated in a longer stream of history, one that was being made by communities writ large, by social movements, not just one person.
Mm-hmm. And so, when we think about having these conversations in the classroom, for example, like how would you approach this with your students?
Well, we have this conversation, in fact, every semester that I teach my urban history class here at Marquette, which is centered around questions of commemoration in public space. And I think it's important because it's a conversation not just about the things that we think are important in public space, but it's a conversation about who gets to make the decisions about what gets remembered in public space. And so this can kind of expand across a broad spectrum of different topics. One is the question, of course, of statues and naming streets. The other is the questions of historic designation, which buildings get preserved. We think about the different markers that we have in public space. And so, unfortunately, the Chavez situation is part of a longer set of case studies that I would use and I will use in the future with my students as we think about, the reckonings of 2020 and the way in which protesters in cities all across the country were demanding the removal of not only Confederate monuments celebrating individuals who were slaveholders, but also conversations that we had about the founding fathers. What does it mean to commemorate someone like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington? The conversation about Chavez is part of that longer conversation that we need to have as communities, as we think about whose history gets preserved and in what ways are we telling those stories in a way that's not static, which can really fall into the trap that happens when you have a physical documentation, but also that are fluid and that are active and that invite all of us to be a part of the conversation. The last thing that I want to note here is to really reemphasize the opportunity this presents us, specifically as a Wisconsin community. There are so many aspects of Latino history in our state that still to this day continue to be ignored, silenced, or kind of live within the shadows of people's attics, of people's closets. And we have to think about what this opportunity offers us, how we can commemorate Latino history, and thinking about the Latino communities that deserve historical commemoration in our city and across our state. So while we're thinking about the future, not just of 16th Street, not just the statues commemorating Chavez, we should be thinking about how can we do a better job of educating ourselves about this history to make sure that all of us become better stewards of our city and our state's history.
Sergio Gonzalez is an associate professor of history at Marquette University. He spoke with WUWM race and ethnicity reporter Teran Powell.
Lake Effect is a daily talk show on WUWM, Milwaukee's local NPR station. It's a show where we share the stories about the people, places, and organizations that shape the city. If you enjoyed this episode of Lake Effect Spotlight, subscribe to the podcast. You can find all of Lake Effect's conversations at WUWM.com/Lake Effect, and we're on the radio Monday through Friday at noon on 89.7.
This is Tanya Mosley, co-host of Fresh Air. You'll see your favorite actors, directors, and comedians on late-night TV shows or YouTube. But what you get with Fresh Air is a deep dive. Spend some quality time with people like Billie Eilish, Questlove, Ariana Grande, Stephen Colbert, and so many more. We ask questions you won't hear asked anywhere else. Listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.